This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
Obviously, you guys know I prefer organizations that flow counter to the mainstream narrative, and I've got the perfect one to tell you about. That would be Texas Scorecard. They were founded back in 2015 by a former Ron Paul congressional press secretary. They are Texas-based, Texas-focused counter-culture media organization. How cool is this? They've got podcasts, videos, live programming, a really nice print edition. They've got guest commentaries, very popular daily email newsletter that will highlight the biggest stories of the day. You can actually trust these guys without the mainstream leftist spin put on much of the news we unfortunately see these days. Their mission: disrupt statism and reconstitute self-governance. They do not want a seat at the table. They want to get rid of the table. They are pro-citizen. They will be your one-stop shop for Texas politics and news. That is for damn sure. I actually mean that because lately I wanted to know some of the stuff that was going on here. I DM'd Texas Scorecard to find out what was going on. They serve those who are tired of being lied to by the mainstream media. That would be you. That would be me as well. They do not align with any party. They work hard to hold lawmakers on both sides of the aisle accountable. Their reporting was directly responsible for taking down the corrupt Republican Speaker of the House, Dennis Bonnen. And check this out, the coolest part of this: nonprofit, no paywalls. All of the reporting is always free. You can find them on any social media channel by searching Texas Scorecard, facebook.com/Texas Scorecard, Twitter @Texas Scorecard, and then they're on YouTube as well, youtube.com/Texas Scorecard. You can find their free daily newsletter. Sign up for it over at texasminute.com. Go check out Texas Scorecard. You will not be disappointed.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, cause I call him the hologram graph, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lorditis, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Counterflow Podcast. What a time I had at the RU Texas, the Renegade University Texas event here in Lockhart, Texas. At the end of this episode, I will give you some of my thoughts on how it all went down and what went down and the good times that I had. But for now, let's get to this episode. I know I cannot be the only one that looks around at society and sees what's going on in the news and goes through my everyday life wondering what in the world has happened to the mental state of many on the left in this country. What is this weird psychosis that drives progressives? They seem to have gone nuts. And I know a lot of you guys feel the same way. And I happened to stumble upon an author and a psychoanalyst named Dr. Richard Kradin. I started diving into a few of his books, and I knew I had to get him on because he's answering so many of the questions that I have about exactly what is going on in the heads of the left these days. And, you know, if you can't get Ted Kaczynski, who had quite a analysis of this as well, which you can't, you got to get Dr. Richard Kradin. And we're going to get into basically this psychosis of the modern left, what drives their thought process and in their quest for control, and what we can do about it. And here's why this guy is so good at this. Dr. Richard Kradin is a senior physician at Massachusetts General Hospital, a psychoanalyst, and a professor at Harvard Medical School. He holds a postgraduate degree in comparative religion from Harvard University and lectures nationally and internationally on these topics. And he's here on Counterflow to discuss some of these topics. Dr. Richard Kradin, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is your first time on my show, and so just to give my audience a bit of an intro on who you are, what you do, and And, we'll talk about some books that you've written. Who are you? What do you do? And let my audience know really whatever you think's important for them to know right off the bat.
Well, I guess I'm a physician. I've practiced medicine in the city of Boston at Mass General Hospital. I'm a professor at Harvard Medical School. I'm also a psychoanalyst. I did training both in medicine and psychoanalysis. And so I have a really rather eclectic training, at least, and an interest in how everything reflects on what's going on in the political world today.
You said Harvard Medical School. Let me ask you this. Over the years, how has, let's see, what's the kindest way to phrase this? How have the students changed over the years? If they have, maybe I'm going into this with the assumption that they have, but if they have, how have they changed over the years?
I think the greatest change that I observed over the years was an increased sensitivity on the part of the students. First of all, there are many more women than were there when I first began training, so the demographics has changed. The diversity has increased substantially. But the sensitivity, I think, to criticism and a penchant for political correctness is probably the greatest change that I've observed.
When was there a year where you can say it seems like after this point it went that way, or has it just been slowly and incrementally happening?
I started there in 1978, and certainly that was not the case when I began. I would say somewhere towards the mid-1980s and certainly by the 1990s.
Okay, interesting. One of the reasons I got you on, because I'm looking around now thinking there's a lot of people, seemingly most of the time on the left, that seem like there's something wrong mentally. There's some kind of psychosis going on over the country right now. 2016 is when, after that election, is when I started noticing it. I don't know if maybe it was lying dormant before that and Trump kind of ripped off some giant Band-Aid. One of my friends, it really became clear what a person I know personally wrote once on social media: every day that Donald Trump is president, I wake up and get just a little bit crazier. And so when I started seeing and reading some of your books, it started to answer some questions for me. Is modern leftism naturally rooted in some type of anger and resentment? Do you think that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's always been the nature of the left, going back probably to the French Revolution is where I think you can probably begin to date it. But in the Frankfurt School, in the interwar era, the resentment following the loss by Germany of World War I. And certainly, I think it really reached this country substantially in the 1960s. And I recall that very well because I lived through it and was in some level engaged in it. But there was a resentment that came along with the advent of feminism, with the advent of the civil rights movement. It was an unleashing of a long dormant anger, or a simmering anger, which I think has persisted and was, the scab was really torn off, I think, when Trump was elected. I mean, it had been kind of moving in that direction over the last 50 years. But I think Trump's election really drove people into a downward spiral of what could probably be termed psychosis.
Is it being too short-sighted to just look back at the Obama years and ask, did Obama just lull people to sleep, or was this some kind of almost like spoiling of the left where it allowed them to just be happy and everyone seemed to get along better through those years? Or was there something just kind of bubbling right under the surface ready to explode?
I think everybody got along better because there was greater homogeneity. Because the left, at some level, really has essentially won the culture wars.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Obama as president, you had your first black president, you had your first basic socialism, perhaps communist president. And so he just fed into what was being taught in the academy and what was generally being felt amongst most of the liberals in the country and the liberal elites. And when he lost to Trump, it was just outrage. You know, how could this possibly happen? This is from their perspective, this is our country, this is our culture, and we're not going to move back to some conservative place that represents the middle of the country that we have no interest in.
Is there something specifically about Trump that did this in your mind? In other words, say it was Jeb Bush that won, would we have witnessed the same type of psychosis, or was it Donald Trump's demeanor and aura about him that really helped drive this wedge between people?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that virtually everybody in the country and perhaps in the Western world is at some level been inculcated and indoctrinated, at least in part, into progressive thinking.
Yes.
It's been around for a long time now. So most people have some element of progressive ideology at the core. Donald Trump was clearly an outlier. And I think the biggest difference between Trump and, let's say, Jeb Bush is that Donald Trump really is a winner. And he has the mentality of a winner, and he has the common sense to understand what it takes to win. He certainly was not apologetic about who he was or what he thought the country should be. And I think that really fed into a certain degree of anger on the part of the population, of the populace, who really had been indoctrinated into thinking that winning is really something that only tyrannical governments do or fascists do. It's winning is not something that we're supposed to be doing. And certainly, Obama was an individual who spread that word really globally by apologizing for American exceptionality across the world. So I think that's the biggest difference. And Trump was just who he was. He was straightforward, he was honest, and he was unapologetic. And he was competent. And he was effective. And all of these things certainly, drew back the curtain on the political elite, progressive elite in this country, who, as you can see from what's going on in the country today, are really completely incompetent and unable to get anything done in any meaningful way. But that may be part of the plan. I mean, without sounding paranoid, I think part of the socialist leftist plan is basically to undo the exceptionality of the country. And so opening up the border and making it essentially no longer a nation state per se, and allowing the economy to go into the tank, it is really part of the plan to reduce this country to something that's no longer exceptional.
You wrote about envy being a strong psychological motivating factor, and there's so many interesting quotes in the one of the books I'm kind of pulling a lot of this from is called Out of Control: Apocalyptic Psychology in the Age of Trump, just so my audience knows that. But one of these, there's so many quotes that I'm highlighting in there by you. Envy cannot be sustained without eventually turning in on itself. We often hear the left eats their own. So if they're motivated by envy, which they seem to be, is there some optimism in there somewhere?
Yeah, you may have the same optimism that you saw as took place with the outcome of the French Revolution or the outcome of Soviet Russia, that eventually it collapses. No, I don't think this is not a sustainable mode of being in the world, but it may be something that does great harm in the short term. And it's hard to predict how long this will continue. But, I think based on what we're seeing today in politics, it's very likely that, the current administration won't last out, at least as a majority in the Congress through the next election.
If you need anything CBD related, I've got the store for you, palomaverdecbd.com, and I've got a promo code for you, BUCK, B-U-C-K. Check out, get you 25% off of your order. They've got everything you'll need that's CBD related. They've got tinctures, they've got salve, they've got these soft gels, they've got an amazing sleep bundle. Check that one out. And I've told you before, the pet stuff, the pet CBD tinctures, the CBD dog chews. My French Bulldog Lux walks like a new man now, a new French Bulldog man, that is. That's because I put it on his food in the morning and in the evening. And now he's got a brother. I've got a new French Bulldog here at the house, George. We've adopted George now. He's 4 years old. I got to put this stuff now in his food so he ages a little bit more gracefully than Lux did. So I'll be going back for more. If you've got a pet, I'm telling you this stuff works wonders. If you got a sore back or you work out a lot and you get sore, I'm telling you there, I've told you before, the muscle cream works wonders, the sports cream. The sleep pack works wonders, and the promo code works wonders. That's palomaverdecbd.com, promo code BUCK for 25% off of your order. Carlos and Vanessa Abelar out of San Antonio that own this business, really great people. They're like-minded. They want to support a show like this that I put out every week for you guys. Give them some business. In turn, it gives me some business. And in turn, I keep cranking out these shows on a weekly basis. palomaverdecbd.com, promo code BUCK for 25% off of your order. Let's get back to the show. I want to talk about the obsessional personality because that's a topic throughout the book that I just mentioned. Risk aversion, perfectionism, which it took a bit to even sink into my own mind because many on the left that I know personally are far from perfect. But what are the traits of the obsessional personality, and where does this classification even originate from?
Well, the idea of the obsessional personality is a long-standing construct in the world of psychiatry. So it goes back at least over a century. And it's based on observations of certain personality types. And my intro into this whole area was just by observing what I saw as many obsessional personalities around me at the workplace. Mm-hmm. And that's what I initially attributed much of what was going on until I began to see perhaps the larger political way in which it was reflected. The obsessional personality is a rigid personality. Okay, that's the first thing to say. And it shares that rigidity with certain other personality types, including paranoid personalities. And so you often see overlaps there as well. And I think you see that in what's taking place in society today. The perfectionism often takes the form of a utopian idealism for people on the left. They begin to see things as good and bad, black and white, with some idea in their mind of what the perfect equity-driven society is going to be. And so that's a big part of how their perfectionism manifests itself. It also makes them basically impervious or very resistant to being criticized, which again is something that you see. And as I mentioned, one of the things that I saw taking place amongst my students. But there are many other aspects to obsession which are really very interesting, including a form of sadomasochism, with masochism possibly being the operative element here, where one sees oneself as allowing oneself to be a victim. So it's a victimized mentality, and that fits well into the Marxist idea of the oppressed and the oppressor, and so they kind of fit hand in glove together. The rigidity again makes them prone to projections, which means that essentially, simply put, what they're guilty of doing, they see in others, which certainly was what took place during the Trump administration and the accusations made against Donald Trump, virtually all of them untrue, at least objectively, but apparently reflecting things that they were up to themselves, certainly the whole Russia collusion story being one of them. And so, again, the type of personality is really, I would say, what we're seeing as the underlying mentality, if you will, of the left is a rigid personality, which includes elements of narcissism, obsessionality, and paranoia. And I think if you throw those in a kind of healthy mix, you've got the average mentality of people who are active, at least on the left.
And it seems like the obsessional personality leads to also a lust to control others.
Absolutely.
And that's rooted in some type of anxiety as well. I want to talk to you about that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the desire to control is certainly one of the cardinal features of obsessionality. And you see that if you know obsessional individuals, they're very controlling. That's the term that we often use. And the idea of that is that it is driven by some form of free-floating or existential anxiety. And that may well be the case as the moral structures in society have begun to break down. Religion was essentially the thing that held societies together with a certain moral fabric. As that breaks down or has broken down over the last 100 years or so, you're seeing an increased level of anxiety, which is then manifest as rigid personalities, particularly as obsessionality.
You often hear about leftism being kind of a secular religion of sorts, and it's like they've replaced God with, I don't know, the self, or what have they replaced God with, actually? I'd like to ask you that.
They've replaced God with secular humanism, with the idea that man is the center of all things and ultimately the controlling factor of all things. And by all means, and I think this was partly reflected in the title of my book, this is a secular religion, if you will, and it's one that's hell-bent on destroying any other competing form of religion. So what we're really going through in a strange way are religious wars, a la what one saw in Europe at the time of the Protestant Reformation. It's a competing ideas of what's transcendent good, if you will, but one placing it in a transcendent individual and another placing it in man.
Yes, and there's a Puritanism to it, and I find it interesting. It does seem rooted back in, you just mentioned the Reformation. Is that, it's like this, you could have this linear history of Puritanism, and now I do see it a lot in progressivism.
Absolutely. Again, I think if you are a student of comparative religion, you see how very closely what is going on now mimics what's gone on in religious movements in the past. And so with the Protestant Reformation, you saw the rebellion, if you will, against Roman Catholicism, but then also the breakdown of sectarian religious movements within Protestantism, and the persecution, if you will, of other modes of religious thinking, and the witch trials, and so the kind of mass hysteria and the cancel culture that we're seeing now is not very different than what was seen during these religious reformative movements. So that's the real struggle, I think, that we're up against today.
How does COVID fall into this, the COVID moment, I should say, not the actual virus itself? That seemed to take the psychosis of the left in our society and twist it even into a much tighter knot, so to speak. And again, the controlling aspect comes into this, obviously, and you would even hear it in these phrases often: wear the damn mask, take the damn vaccine, stay the F home. And there's all these, it's just like a controlling, they try to wrap this whole control mechanism in like kindness, that I care about all of these people, so stay the fuck home, and things like that. Let me ask you then, how does this whole COVID moment fit with what you've seen so far in the leftist mindset?
Well, it fits in with respect to what we were just discussing, and that is the level of anxiety that has been imposed on the world as a result of the potentially real dangers, to some people at least, of this virus. And so the desire to control and certainly to control others in order to maintain one's individual safety is, I think, what's really driving this COVID crisis, if you will. And the left has taken advantage of that to use as, because the state leftist mindset is that we will protect you. And so these people are willing to barter off or give away their freedoms so in order that the state will protect them. The problem is the state can't protect them because there really is no foolproof protection from this virus. I think one of the great casualties of this COVID virus has been the damage that's been done to science. Because what we're seeing now, what's being offered to us by the government and even by the medical profession, is no longer empirical science. It's an unfortunate mix of some degree of kernel of scientific truth with a lot of irrational ideas, which is part of what also takes place in the obsessional personality. There's a great level of irrationality that they don't tend to recognize in themselves. So I think that's what we're suffering from now with COVID. This is the opportunity for those obsessionals to want to control everything around them, and for the state to take control of everything that they can take control of. If people will cede their rights to the government.
You studied Jungian psychology, Carl Jung. I want to bring some of that up in this discussion as well. And again, we mentioned projection, and he talked about reclaiming the shadow. Otherwise, it'll be projected onto others.
Yeah.
Talk about how that fits into what we've been seeing a lot, and not even just with the elite who are doing this, but I see it just in the rank and file left, people that I know.
Well, consciousness, as we go through our day, aware of what we're doing, is based on what Freud termed an ego ideal. That is what, we all tend to want to think of ourselves in certain ways. And many people want to think of themselves, understandably, as good people, as virtuous people, etc. When you have a rigid personality, the elements that are difficult for consciousness to absorb are essentially suppressed. And in that suppression, they're often projected because they're just incompatible with one's sense of who one is. So this is why you see seemingly virtuous, good people wishing the worst for their fellow man around them, and acting in the most vitriolic and hateful ways, because essentially they've been unable to incorporate the aspects of themselves which are less than perfect, which are less than virtuous, but which are part of the human condition. And so rather than accept that this is their imperfection, they will then project it onto others and then attack the other. And I think that's, simply put, I think what we're seeing amongst these virtuous people on the left. They're concerned for real people. Their concern for their fellow man in any genuine way is essentially absent. Okay, there, and this is, I talk about this in the book, and this is also well known. They have a tremendous ability to abstract situations and to produce ideologies, which are always abstractions and never really get to the actual situation at hand. So they can talk about being kind to people coming in through the southern border, but have no concern about the people who have to live at the border and see their lives disrupted, becoming victims of crime, being prone to possible COVID infection from unvaccinated people. This doesn't concern them because their level of abstraction from reality is substantial. So they're ideologues, and ideologues are always dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well put. Virtue signaling is that, I mean, that kind of touches upon this, and it seems to be more ubiquitous now than it was at least 10 years ago. Is that same kind of obsessional psychology rooted in the phenomenon of virtue signaling, pretending to care about things, and it's always so flimsy. It's not an actual act of caring. It's a flimsy message, basically.
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that most of the people who are guilty of this virtue signaling, and I'll say guilty of it, are really not conscious of the fact that they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some cynical people in Washington who really have a plan and know what they're doing because their whole life is just a falsehood. But I think the vast majority of people out in society who think of themselves as virtuous really have no inkling that perhaps they're not. And to suggest to them that they're not is to essentially threaten them again and make them paranoid. And so you'll see you will be attacked if you even suggest it. So this is why speech is being canceled. Mm-hmm. This is the whole political correct endeavor. It's a way to essentially expunge any controversy, any challenge to one's internal system of thought and being, so that they can maintain their illusion of being virtuous.
Well, it doesn't seem to speak too well of the possibilities of a future where right and left can live together and have open discussions and healthy discussions and healthy discourse.
No, I think what people need to understand is the difference, I think, between true liberalism and what we're seeing from the progressive left is that the essence of the liberal endeavor is a conversation. It's the ability to converse with others, to acknowledge that other people have different ways of seeing things, and to, by the efforts of persuasion, see if one can begin to come to some sort of compromise situation with another. That's what real liberalism is, and that's the root of most genuine religion as well. Okay. The religion of the left, the progressive movement, is to impose one's thoughts and one's behaviors on others. It's a power-driven procedure. And so there's no room for conversation. There's no room for diversity of thought. There can only be cancellation, and in its worst form, basically expunging those individuals entirely. So that's a real concern. What's going on in the country currently now is a genuine concern, and I think it's important that people understand the threat that it really poses for civilization as we know it.
How would you suggest people on the right fight this phenomenon? And I think one issue is that people on the right often don't just get obsessed with politics. They're more obsessed with their family and church and going to work and providing for their basic small in group here. And yet the left keeps growing taking over every institution. They've got control of everything. How would a healthy right-leaning society fight this encroachment?
Well, I think they first need to understand that they are being threatened. If their concerns are primarily insular and related to their own family and their own subgroup, it's understandable. But the left is making war on the family. It's making war on religion. It's making war on these subgroups that think other than themselves. So I think the first thing is to recognize that they are genuinely being challenged and genuinely being threatened with extinction. And so I think the answer to dealing with the left is probably not to try to engage them in discussion, because I don't think that's possible. I think it's to win. It's to somehow band together and exert the same sort of force that the left has tried to over the last 50 years and essentially expunge them, because they're a force of evil, quite frankly, in the world.
Yeah, you're speaking my language. Are you able to, let me ask, do your colleagues know your politics, read the books you write? At least, are they aware of the books that you write? Do you get pushback?
I'm probably one of a very small handful of people who feel the way I do or think the way I do at my institution. Do I get pushback? Yes. Are my thoughts popular? No. And so it is what it is. But I know what I'm dealing with, and I think I understand the tactics of the left. I think part of the strategy of the left is to take advantage of the naivete of individuals and to take advantage of their genuine good-naturedness with the idea that they're not going to push back, that they're not going to fight back. But I think it's important that we begin to recognize that that's part of their strategy, and that we're going to have to take a much more active and resistant role in dealing with them. And one of the things that really must take place, and we're beginning to see evidence of that at some level, is that we have to take back our educational systems. Because if our children are educated in this manner, all is lost. Because once they're indoctrinated into this way of thinking, it's going to be extremely difficult to pull them back into another mindset. Most people are not courageous. Most people are not leaders. Most people tend to go along with the flow and just go along to get along. It's understandable. But there is a time when you have to really stand up and say, we're not going to put up with this.
What's up, Counterflow audience? If you're listening to this show, obviously you're a person who cares about their liberty. You may even be one of these people that's kind of tired of waiting around for political change, tired of being upset by the same old from the LP, tired of all of this nonsense while you think, what should I really be doing? If you're ready to take matters into your own hands, then I want to tell you about a new community called the Nomad Network. The Nomad Network is the #1 community for liberty-minded people just like you and me who want to create freedom in their lifetime by focusing on the things that you can actually change: entrepreneurship, investment, and income mobility. The people over at the Nomad Network, Jason Stapleton, these guys are preaching how to actually make your life more free and better without having to join a political party and go through the same old motions year after year. Whether you have an existing business, looking to start one, or simply want to network with other like-minded people, the Nomad Network is the place for you. The best part is, obviously, everyone likes this. It's free to join. You hear me? Free to join. Go to www.nomadnetwork.app/buck right now to see what everyone is talking about. That is www.nomadnetwork.app/buck to get your free account today. See you there. How has social media impacted this psychosis we've seen?
Well, social media is a disaster. Social media is a disaster at many, many levels. It's a megaphone, for this type of thinking. It allows people to exert influence that normally they never would have been able to. So mobs of individuals on social media can actually ruin an individual's life or profession, whereas before, that wasn't possible. The whole digital information age is problematic because it's one of the things, and I know that this in my own experience, it's one of the things that people who seek control now have a technology in which they can really exert their control in a way that was never at all possible. So you see now the desire for the IRS or the administration to have the IRS look at things that are going on in your bank account for $600 exchanges or more. The idea of doing away with money altogether so that everything is digitalized and available as information to centralized forces who wish to look at them. So the social media is truly problematic, and something I think normally would be done about social media, except for the fact that, the other problem that we're all facing now is the government in Washington is essentially totally corrupt. You've got a corrupted government. You've got people on both sides of the aisle taking money from individuals and companies and technology companies. So they're not going to speak up and they're not going to put their foot down. I mean, you have a president now who may well be a complete crook. What's going on with him and his son and his brother has been going on for years. And, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that someone doesn't become a multimillionaire just from being a senator. So between social media, the mainstream media, which has just become a propaganda arm for the administration, what we're looking at now, it's very, very interesting at some level because it's kind of an odd mix between Marxism, which a lot of people tend to think it is, and fascism, because the two of them are really not that different. They both involve the state and state control. But what you're seeing, I think, here in America is a corporocracy, if you will. It's the large corporations who have now taken control of the government, or the government is taking control of the of the corporations, or they're working hand in hand. It's hard to know. But essentially, that's really what's taking place. I'm not sure we're looking at the type of socialist Marxist society that maybe Bernie Sanders is propounding for. It's something much more sinister than that.
Do you get a sense from just looking around and talking to folks that kind of normal mainstream Americans are waking up to some of this? It seems to me there's an emperor has no clothes phenomenon going on where you look at CNN and they're telling you this narrative that they want everyone to believe we're in this world that we're in. And then you look around in real life and it's not that way. I see that, but I worry that not enough people feel that way. Do you see normal people kind of waking up to some of this?
Well, at some level, the Biden administration is both a curse and a gift.
Yes.
It's a curse and a blessing, because it's a curse in terms of what it's able to do and what it's not doing in order to maintain the society. But on the other hand, it is so obviously incompetent. It is so obviously unable to deal with the issues that confront Americans, that at least as you see from the polls, more and more independent voters at least are beginning to see that this administration is not functioning. And so the people on the left, I mean, they're never going to change their mind about what's going on. This is whatever goes on is better than anything the right will ever have to offer. So the key is going to be the independents in this country, and hopefully there's more of them than we think, because as they catch on to what's happening, hopefully we can restore the country to some degree of sanity.
Yeah, I look at the craziness as it happens, and I kind of want just a little bit more of it. For instance, I think Kamala Harris taking over, like you said, it's a curse and a blessing. But the further uh, the insanity's pushed, I think the more people would wake up. If that sounds like I'm an accelerationist of sorts, but do you think that as enough people see and feel this, like, my God, things are getting out of control, the better we end up being because we're headed towards a better solution?
I think the key is going to be whether the Republicans in this Congress have what it takes to stand up to these people in the Democratic Party so that they can block as much as possible of their current administrative goals. Because we have 3.5 more years of the Biden administration, whether we like it or not. If Biden disappears, we have Harris. If Harris disappears, you've got Nancy Pelosi. Nothing is going to remove these people short of an election in 2024. But hopefully, if we can hold them in check through the next election, where hopefully at least the House of Representatives will turn, then I think there's a chance to hold things intact. But if the people in Washington right now, the Republicans, the rhinos, whatever you want to call them, the corrupt politicians on the right, if they let things go, then we're going to have a hard time putting Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Are you optimistic at all that some of that could happen? That there are some congressmen with backbone and who are actual leaders to stop some of this? Are you optimistic?
There certainly are some. The question is whether there's enough of them. You would need basically all of them to hang together. And they may on certain issues. It's really hard to know. I think they see that they're under threat as well from their own constituents if they don't. And what's surprising to me is that the Democratic Party doesn't recognize that it's in store for a real disaster in the next midterm election, unless it begins to modify some of its positions. But I think its feeling is if it can push through as much as it can, it will transform the whole situation so that it won't matter anymore. So I think what goes on over the next next year or so is really critical.
Let's plug away for you all of your work, where people can find your books, and feel free to talk about and mention any of your books.
Well, you've mentioned Out of Control. I wrote a sequel to that. It's called Never Trump. And it basically talks about, I think in more detail, what transpired around the last election. I have a recent book that talks about the role of psychotherapy and the infiltration of psychotherapy by the progressive left, so that we've become a nation of victims and a culture of therapy, which is, again, part of the leftist regimen for the country. And so the psychotherapeutic profession has become part of it. I'm writing a book at the moment about the medical profession, which has also been deeply infiltrated by progressivism, and because the medical elite is part of the elites that are the same people running everything else in this country. And so what we're getting in terms of medical information is less than truly scientific at this point. So those are some of the books that I have over the last several years. And I think your readers might find them interesting. I don't know.
On that medical issue, you said that medical elite's part of this problem too, being infiltrated by leftism. Have you seen that with the COVID moment?
Oh, absolutely.
How so? I'd love to get your opinion on that before I get you out of here.
Okay, well, first of all, I think people should understand that the people who become physicians are academically accomplished. And so they go through, the basic the basic mills, the progressive mills of education. That's, and the ones who come from the Ivy League backgrounds, are much more likely to gain entrance to a very competitive medical establishment. And so they've all been trained pretty much in the same way, and the vast majority of them hold progressive ideas. I think what we're seeing today with the coronavirus, as I've mentioned, is a travesty, because the science related to what they're trying to sell from people like Dr. Fauci and my ex-colleague from the CDC now, is really not based, from what I can make out as a scientist, in actual empirical science. Certainly part of it is the idea of vaccination is a longstanding concept. But again, one of the things you learn if you really delve into the way medicine functions is that you have to look at things empirically. That is, you have to look at the actual facts, and that theories can't replace facts in science. So it may sound good to vaccinate everybody, but there's really very little evidence that very young children, for instance, get this disease in a way that results in serious illness or death. I mean, the fraction of kids who die under the age of 5 is, essentially zero. And so to be talking about vaccinating those young people, there's no empirical basis for it. It's pure ideology. Masks don't work, I mean, they work for a certain form of spread of droplet, but they don't work at the level of the size of these viruses. So the idea of everyone walking around with their virtue signaling mask outdoors when they're alone, I mean, it's just pure irrational nonsense. And for these people, including the medical establishment, to be saying that this is science, well, it's not science, it's irrationality. And so, I mean, this is the problem. Science has been also infiltrated by this, and it's been infiltrated in part because there are tremendous amounts of money to be made, both by the pharmaceutical companies and by the academic institutions that partner with these pharmaceutical companies. And so it's corrupted. Medicine is also corrupted, like virtually everything else, by just too much money floating around in unscrupulous ways. And the underlying morality of the country, of most individuals in the country, or at least many, has really also just basically been dissipated. So what you would expect is moral behavior from people in positions of leadership, including physicians, just isn't present in the same way that it was 50, 100 years ago. It's just gone. They will do what is best for them. And if it's best for them is saying the same thing that their colleagues are saying and getting rich as a result of it, then that's what they'll do.
Is saying the things that you just said amongst your colleagues considered taboo, or could you have a discussion like this?
No, you can't have a discussion like this. No. I don't attempt to have discussions with my colleagues about these things. I mean, if there's a like-minded colleague, an open-minded colleague, and there are some, you can have this discussion. But many are just as closed-minded as anybody who you see on the far left, activist, progressive left. They can't hear it because, again, they would have to examine who they are to actually admit some of this. And they're not in a position to do that easily.
Wow. All right. Is there a publishing website my listeners should go to get the books, or they go at Amazon.com?
They're all on Amazon.com, and that would be the place to find them.
Excellent. I'll link to some of them in the show notes page for this episode. Dr. Richard Kradin, thank you so much for being here.
You're really welcome. Thank you.
Yes, sir. What a great conversation with Dr. Richard Kradin. I hope you guys got something out of that. I know I did, and I will link to some books of his that I have and that I read. And if you want to read further on these topics, I think you'll find them quite interesting and quite an easy and palatable read. So, as for this show, and Are You Texas? Well, first of all, subscribe to the YouTube page for this show, please. Just search Counterflow with Buck Johnson on YouTube. Subscribe to the page, and you can watch all of these videos and more on that page. And I'm almost there, guys. I'm almost at that monetization level. So share around, subscribe, all of that good stuff. As for RU Texas, what a wonderful event we had here in Lockhart, Texas. Of course, it's put on by Thaddeus Russell, owner and proprietor of the Renegade Media Network, which this podcast is a part of. It was just wonderful to hang out and do some interviews and chat with a lot of the folks that listen to this show and are part of that whole network and listenership. I will say, I got to thank some people. My producer, the producer of this show, of course, runs Podsworth Media. Chris worked his ass off the entire weekend, running sound, making sure everything was dialed in. And thank you so much, Chris. And what a job he did. The staff of RU, the Renegade staff, man, those guys are really hardworking. It was impressive. James Gentleman, Landry, Jeb, it was like a well-oiled machine. It was so nice to see. I had some very, very good help. My friend India was amazing. So thank you. I know she listened to the show. Special shout out to my friends Becky and Brooke. A lot of help went into this weekend. And then, of course, the guests. Hotep Jesus was awesome. Got to hang out with him. Jack the Perfume Nationalist, Scott Horton, Cody Wilson. My goodness, this guy he's like the silent killer, very heady. I really enjoyed chatting with him, getting to watch him do his thing. And of course, Tho Bishop was with us, Matt Erickson. I got to get those guys up and do some chatting for the crowd. Tommy Salmons, of course, from Year Zero podcast. Matt and I made an appearance on his podcast. After everything was done, we did a little recording here. And man, it was just such a weekend. Robbie the Fire Bernstein, Kyle Ruff. We had a comedy night out at Load Off Fanny's here in the square in Lockhart. What a great night. And of course, Thaddeus Russell, the man who put it all together, was great. I interviewed him. I think that's going to be out on his podcast, Unregistered. Maybe we'll put it out here as a bonus. We'll see. Still got to sort all of those details out. But it was a great success, and thank you guys. I got to meet my man Bruce, too. It was really cool to see and meet some of you guys that listen to this show. What a cool experience. And if you want more experiences like that, there is one coming up in Sayulita, Mexico, put on by Johnny Profita from the Peddling Fiction podcast. That is going to be a lot of fun. It's December 10th through 12th, and there's a link to get tickets to that in the show notes page for this episode. I'll read you the quick description of this event in Mexico. I cannot wait for this. Join Peddling Fiction's Johnny Profita and special guests Lions of Liberty Mark Clare, Michael Rechtenwald, Martha Bueno, Liberty Lockdown's Clint Russell, Counterflow's Buck Johnson, and Borderless Blogs James Guzman, and COVID Jesus, a.k.a. the King of the Cocks, Robbie the Fire Bernstein. For a weekend of libertarian fun in the sun, the event takes place in Sayulita, a small surf town about 45 minutes north of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, where, for all intents and purposes, COVID ceases to exist. How about that? There's going to be a VIP happy hour with all of us, a catered event, access to all the events in Sayulita, Saturday and Sunday. There's a pool beach party at the Peninsula Condos in Puerto Vallarta. I cannot wait for this. Also, there's a guest that I have coming up in the next few weeks. I don't want to give her name away yet, but I'm going to see if she's interested in going as well. She happens to live there, so why not show up, right? More to come on that. As for us, I guess I've talked your ear off enough. I hope you enjoyed my interview here with Dr. Richard Kradin. Next week's guest is pretty amazing. A little hint about it. It's someone that doesn't make many media appearances. And I already know who some of you are thinking. I'll tell you this too. It's a person that's never been on my show before it was called Counterflow or since it's called Counterflow. I've never interviewed this person. I can't wait. You guys have an excellent week. I will see you soon.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.